The second will be on the Islamic Empire next Friday. As always, there will be an opportunity for our audience, both on Microsoft Teams and on YouTube, to post any questions relating to tonight's topic, and we hope to be able to get through as many of these in the last 15 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Iqbal Sahib to deliver tonight's lecture. Jazakallah, Dr. Sahib.
Jazakallah Wakar. First, to get through the technical points, so do I press the PowerPoint or the share button first?
The share button first.
Okay, share button, and then hopefully my PowerPoint. Get it to the right spot.
Perfect.
Good. So, Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thank you to Wakar and Nadeem Saab for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all. First of all, a little plug on Living History, which is part of Voice of Islam Radio. My passion for history is really from student days, but I have the honor of being the producer and host of the Living History program. With my colleagues Arif and Amjad, I think we've done a good job. We've got about 25 plus programs on there on Islamic history and a variety of other history programs as well. So a lot of the information I'm going to present to you today is covered from student days, but I have the honor of being the producer and host of the Living History program. With my colleagues Arif and Amjad, I think we've done a good job. We've got about 20 you all why history is important. You'll recall the very first revelation to the Holy Prophet ﷺ was in their Surah Al-Alaq, chapter 96, verses 1 to 9. And I'll read it to you. It says, in the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, recite. Some write proclaim, but whatever. So recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from a clinging form, i.e. an embryo. A lot of translation use blood clot, but it's a clinging form, which I believe is embryo. Recite, thy Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not. Nay, man does indeed transgress because he thinks himself to be independent. Surely unto thy Lord is the return. So apart from reminding us of our biological development over many, I believe, thousands of years, God Almighty is reminding us that we were taught by God Almighty, and we learned through our religious scriptures and through our history about what happened in the past, both in terms of the prophets and their followers and other great empires that came and went. So history, I believe, is very, very important for us as Muslims to follow. And this was really the inspiration behind the Living History programs. Now, as I said, today's lecture is on the rise of Islam, and inshallah, I will do another one on a specific empire of the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Turks on the 15th. So I hope that you will find that useful and you will enjoy it. In terms of today's presentation, this is the structure of it over the next hour or so, and I hope you will find it inspiring. I hope you will find it useful. Some of it will probably a memory jogger for many of you. I know many of you are well-informed people. So I'll start off with the origins of Islam and the role of the Holy Prophet and his importance, especially from a Western perspective and Western commentators' point of view, the impact of Islam on shaping world history. Then we will have a quick overview, a bird's eye view from Khilafat al-Rashidun to the Abbasid Empire, Western criticisms and reason why Islam is seen so negatively in the West, and then really to finish off with the golden age of Islamic civilization, some of the great achievements that we've had. I think it would be fair to say the rise of Islam is perhaps the most amazing event in human history, springing from a land and a people like previously negligible, and the Arabs were negligible at that time. Islam spread within a century over half the earth, shattering great empires and ousting long-established religions, remolding the souls of races and building up a whole new world, the world of Islam. That is not just my view, but a view of many unbiased Western commentators over the last century or so. Prior to that, of course, there was a lot of negativity about Islam, but I think there have been many decent Western commentators, and one of them I'm just showing you there, S.P. Scott in History of the Moorish Empire in Europe writes, if the object of religion be the inculcation of morals, the diminution of evil, the promotion of human happiness, the expansion of the human intellect, if the performance of good works will avail in the great day when mankind shall be summoned to its final reckoning, it is neither irreverent nor unreasonable to admit that Muhammad was indeed an apostle of God. That's a great recognition of the fact that the Holy Prophet ﷺ, which we Muslims clearly believe as the messenger of God, is accepted at least by decent Western commentators as a messenger of God, an important person from God Almighty. So that's something for us, I think, to reflect on, and there are many, many other Western commentators. The Holy Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet of Islam, advocated the unity of God and thereby the unity and equality of mankind. That was a great message at that time when you look at all the great empires that were facing the Islam and the Holy Prophet ﷺ. The Quran referred to him as an excellent exemplar in chapter 33, verse 22. He denounced the differences of color and race and was a great promoter of education, advocating, and I quote, his pursuit of learning even onto distant China. If you Muslims have to go to learn knowledge, go even if you have to go to China. He inculcated a love for learning among the illiterate Arabs, which paved the way for their outstanding intellectual achievements, which we are going to cover today. Montgomery Watt is a well-known Orientalist, and in his book Muhammad at Medina, he writes, the more one reflects on the history of Muhammad and of early Islam, the more one is amazed at the vastness of his achievement. Circumstances presented him with an opportunity such as few men have had, but the man was fully matched with the hour. Had it not been for his gift as seer, statesman, and administrator, and behind these his trust in God and firm belief that God had sent him, a notable chapter in the history of mankind would have remained unwritten. So these are just a few Western authors who've made some very, very enduring and positive comments. In recognition of the exceptional character and qualities of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Michael Hart, several years back, wrote a book, The 100 Most Influential People, and believe it or not, the Holy Prophet ﷺ, well, of course we believe it, but he put him as number one compared to all the great figures that have come over the history of mankind, and quite rightly so. Now, in relation to the community of Muslims that the Holy Prophet guided and inspired, the Jewish scholar Max de Montt, in his monumental work, Jews, God and History, writes, in the 6th century, the Arabs were desert nomads. In the 7th century, they were conquerors on the march. In the 8th century, they were masters of an empire that made the Mediterranean a Mohammedan lake. And in the 9th century, they were the standard bearers of a dazzling civilization, leaders in art and architecture and science, while Western Europe was sinking deeper and deeper into a dark morass of their own making. Now, you couldn't really ask for really much clearer picture of the great civilization of Islam. Before we go into some of the achievements and the other bits of the presentation, I just want a quick overview and run through of the Islamic civilization, starting from Khalifa al-Rashidun into the Abbasids. Of course, there were many other empires after that, but just a quick rundown. I've tried to do my best to put as much information for you all as possible. So this is when the Holy Prophet ﷺ passed away. You all know from Mazur all the accounts that has been given over the last 18 months or so of the companions of the Holy Prophet and how much love and affection they had for the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and none more so than Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And quite rightly so, he was chosen as the first caliph. And he was a figure of strength who really kept the unity of the Muslims when they could have fallen apart. And even, great figures like Hazrat Umar were shaken at the death of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. So Hazrat Abu Bakr clearly reminded everyone of the real teachings of the Holy Quran and what the Holy Prophet ﷺ taught. He kept the community together. But of course, as soon as the Holy Prophet ﷺ, rebellion started throughout Arabia, and a lot of his time, it only lasted 2 years, his Khilafat, but a lot of rebellion started, what were known as the Rida Wars. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I've got so much to cover. The map on the right-hand side just shows the area of Arabia that was covered during his 2-year Khilafat. And one of the great assets that he had on his side was the sword of Islam, as Khalid bin Walid, the great commander, great general, who went and firstly put down the rebellions when really there's false prophets that started claiming to be prophets. And Musaylama was probably one of the most dangerous ones who represented a prophetess who claimed to be a prophetess anyway. And he had assembled an army of 40,000 and wanted to march on to Medina, but Khalid bin Walid and the great Muslims counteracted that, defeated them. Having put those down, they had to face the two great empires, the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And we'll go into those in a lot more detail. But the battles, you'll see one of the maps up there. The battle plans Khalid bin Walid had were absolutely amazing, and you really could read a whole history book just in how he defeated the Persians and how quickly, and some of the tactics he used, which are one of the greatest tacticians, I think, as far as warfare goes and planning and strategy. So then, of course, Hazrat Abu Bakr passed away, and we had the Khilafat of Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Anhu, and that lasted 10 years. You can see the periods there, 634 to 644. And this Khilafat was really quite unique in consolidating the gains, but expanding the territory massively. You can see from the map on the right-hand side, over the 10 years, much of Iran was really brought under control, and even Egypt, great empires in their own way, and even the Romans were really brought to their knees. Hazrat Umar achieved many things, but he set a consultative body really to make sure that we didn't have friction and people fighting each other within the world of Islam, and to really elect future successors, etc. And one of the battles you must read is the Battle of Yarmouk. Interestingly, this was a battle where Khalid bin Walid was initially sent by Abu Bakr Raziyallahu Anhu, but on the way Abu Bakr passed away, and for a variety of reasons which are too complex to go in, but you can realize Umar decided to say that we know that he's a great general, but it is Allah who gives great victories to the Muslims. So he basically, Abu Ubaidah, he was replaced by Khalid bin Walid. Although Khalid bin Walid was involved with the Yarmouk campaign. And the great thing is Abu Ubaidah asked him to really plan a lot of the strategy, and Khalid bin Walid, Labak, he just, whether he was a soldier or under anyone's command, he did what was needed to do. But this was where 40,000 Romans were faced by an army of 25,000 Muslims. And the way that battle took place and the strategies were amazing again, and one should remember that. Another point I forgot to mention, when Abu Bakr took over, an army was being prepared to send and face the Romans actually, but he passed away, and there was question marks from many of the followers saying, look, we've got rebellions going on our neighborhood in Dome front, so don't send the army. And of course, Abu Bakr said, who am I to counteract the orders of the Holy Prophet? He wanted the army to go, the army will go there. By the grace of Allah, they achieved both things, and that was a wonderful way of showing that I will obey the Holy Prophet no matter what. Then, of course, the Khilafat passed on to Hazrat Osman and Hazrat Ali, and you can see the two periods there. Hazrat Osman's Khilafat lasted from 644 to 656, quite a long period. Sadly, a lot of the time was spent on trying to put down intrigues by people. But you can see the great expansion of the Muslim empire during his Khilafat as well. But the intrigues went on, and sadly he was martyred, as you know. And Hazrat Ali, unfortunately, also spent the time trying to really quell a lot of these conspiracies and friction that was going on, and he was martyred as well. And Hazrat Ali's Khilafat was from 656 to 661. And then, of course, there were internal battles, as you know. Hazur has mentioned these in his khutbahs quite a lot, so I won't go into detail. So this goes to show that within 30 years of Khilafat-e-Rashidun, how much the Islamic empire had spread. Just look at, I mean, though on that map it just looks a small area, but God, these are massive empires that were just crushed. But of course, it was the spread of Islam that was important, and Muslims were prevented from having wars of aggression. It was only in defense of Islam where it was required. So that is important to remember. And then, of course, we had the problems where Amir Muawiyah took over and all the horrible incidents with Yazid and all that. But the Umayyads, they had the first great Muslim dynasty, and whatever their faults were, but they achieved a lot. They also ventured into Spain, and Muslims also went into Sindh. Muhammad Qasim and his great achievements, and Tariq, who conquered Gibraltar, etc. You all know about that as well. And the Umayyads are two different periods, really. 684 to 750 were the Marwanids, and then after that, Abu Sufyan's descendants, the Marwavids, and then Marwan the first and his successors, basically later on to 720 when they were replaced by the Abbasids. And a lot of the achievements were territorial, but there were some great achievements. But the greatest, the golden age of Islam, really, when everybody talks about Islam and the Arabs, and when you read Professor Hitti's book, History of the Arabs, is during the Abbasid period. And the name Abbasids, of course, is derived from the uncle of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. But the way they came to power was quite intriguing. A lot of the princes were called to a banquet, the Umayyad princes, and they were murdered, basically. Only one prince remained, and he, of course, established his separate Umayyad Khilafat in Spain, etc. But after taking reigns and taking power, the Abbasid dynasty was indeed a golden dynasty, one of the great civilizations of mankind. And again, go to Voice of Islam Living History and you will hear lots and lots of details. But of course, they were brought crashing down by the Mongol invasions later on. And really, the empire split up into a variety of different small emirates, really. That's what we can call them, I suppose. Now, I want to turn to why Islam has such a negative image, and of course we will finish with the positives as well, as I promised. But especially in the last several decades, it's been really quite awful and quite horrible, and I'll come to that later on. But, early Christians clearly had a lot of resentment against the founder of Islam, the Islamic civilizations that cropped up. And for somebody like me, I, as a young child, came from Kashmir at the age of 9, 10, from a remote village, and I grew up in the Western world, and I grew up with Hollywood movies and things that our teachers taught us and everything. And no doubt many of you will remember the great Al Cid movie, Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren. Absolutely remarkable film, really. But here was a great leader of the Western world, Al Cid. His name was Sidi Lord. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was his real name. He was responsible for defeating the Muslims and everything. And as a young child, I had not read Islamic history and didn't have a clue. But, I felt quite attuned to Charlton Heston and Al Cid, and thinking, wow, those Muslims, they look dodgy characters, etc. But it's interesting when real historians and real thoughtful people started investigating and looking. And one of the great figures was the journalist James Burke, who used to present wonderful programs on the BBC. And he wrote a book and made programs for the BBC called The Day the Universe Changed. And he goes on to write, and he says, according to contemporary accounts, while Al Cid may have said his prayers regularly, He was in every other sense a barbarian who raped and pillaged without quarter, teaching the Arabs the art of atrocity. So this was the real Al-Cid, and this is how Hollywood and various other media commentators try to fool you. But the reality is the contemporary understanding of Islam is sadly colored by a mixture of illusion, occasional reality, but prejudice, and sometimes facts, sometimes scholarship, but often gutter journalism. Of course, world politics and strategic interests come into this. Jay? Hello?
It's okay, we'll just have to mute them. Jazakallah.
Shall I carry on?
Yes, carry on, please.
Yeah, okay. So media men and women and Muslim extremists of one form or another are heard and seen discussing Islam, and the more balanced voices of Muslims are drowned. The media in this day and age is king. The images and arguments that flood into Western living rooms daily through the television are ever so important. In these, Islam is usually depicted as the embodiment of evil and hatred, and it is equated with terrorism, fundamentalism, and extremism. If only the scholars of the humanities, the novelists, the media persons, and politicians posing and speaking as instant experts on Islam could learn to read with open hearts and minds, Islam would be seen in a very different light. Now, Islam in the West has had interactions for centuries with the Muslim world, and the present encounter, brought into sharp focus by events such as the Gulf War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, is very much colored by the two earlier encounters. The first, where Islam was in ascendancy, and I've just mentioned some of the things, and we'll go into those in a lot more detail. Ascendancy and the dominant force for well over 1,000 years. And the second, where the Western colonial powers were the dominant force and in control of many Muslim lands through European colonization. One of my favorite Western authors, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, gives an insight into why we see such a jaundiced view of Islam in the West. He says, history has been such that the West's relations with the Islamic world have from the first been radically different from those with any other civilization. Europe has known Islam 13 centuries mostly as an enemy and a threat. It is no wonder that Muhammad, more than any other of the world's religious leaders, has had a poor press in the West, and that Islam is the least appreciated there of any of the world's other faiths. So this really sums up why we're seeing this distorted view. It's very historical and also contemporary because of geostrategic interest. Now, one of the main reasons why Christianity or the West has tried to form a distorted image of Islam was probably because of the feeling of inferiority in which Western Europe confronted Islamic civilization. Soon after the establishment of Islam, Muslims led the march of civilization with outstanding achievements in many fields, in philosophy, literature, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, chemistry, and trade. This was during the dark age of Europe. They linked the pre-Islamic civilizations of Greece, China, Persia, India, Rome, and Egypt to that of the Arabic, and then changed it to that of Renaissance. Their comprehensive achievements were a major contributing factor towards the European Renaissance and a modern civilization. To counteract this, all sorts of false accusations were leveled at Islam, and many Christians were made to feel they were fighting for light against darkness. It was this hatred and rivalry which united the whole of Christian Europe and prompted the Crusades with the sole objective of crushing Islam. The Muslim literary influence was so vast that it was found necessary to translate the Bible and liturgy into Arabic for the use of Christian community living in Spain. Commenting on the state of affairs, a distressed Muslim clergyman wrote, "My fellow Christians delight in the poems and romances of the Arabs. They study the works of Mohammedan theologians and philosophers not in order to refute them, but to acquire a correct and elegant Arabic style. Where today can a layman be found who reads the Latin commentaries on Holy Scriptures? Alas, the young Christians who are most conspicuous for their talents have no knowledge of any literature or language save the Arabic. They read and study with avidity Arabian books. They amass whole vast libraries of them at a vast cost, and they everywhere sing the praises of the Arabian Lord. On the other hand, at the mention of Christian books, they disdainfully protest that such works are unworthy of their notice. The pity of it, Christians have forgotten their own tongue. It's interesting, isn't it? A lot of the Muslim fundamentalists say exactly the same thing now to Muslim youth and Muslim culture in what is going on. But that's how the roles have been reversed. But that's what it was like when Islam was at its great height. Now, whatever the West thought of the founder of Islam, it was difficult not to admire the achievements of the new dazzling civilization that had inspired Baghdad, that had inspired all this. For example, the Caliphate Harun al-Rashid, which was during the period of 786 to 809, I believe. Professor Hitti writes, a city with no peer throughout the whole world. Though less than half a century old, Baghdad had by that time grown from nothingness to a world center of prodigious wealth and international significance. It was a city full of merchants, poets, musicians, singers, dancers, layers, and physicians. It was the city of many tales and legends, including the Arabian Nights. This is another quote, and I'll read it to you from Professor Hitti in the History of the Arabs. In 3/4 of a century after the establishment of Baghdad, the Arabic reading world was in possession of the chief philosophical works of Aristotle, of the leading Neoplatonic commentators, and of most of the medieval writings of Galen, as well as of Persian and Indian scientific works. In only a few decades, Arab scholars assimilated what had taken the Greeks centuries to develop. Within a century of the Hijrah, centers for the translation of books into Arabic were established, and Arabic soon became the international and intellectual medium of communication, which clearly now English is. Well-organized centers of learning equivalent or at least similar to those in modern times were established throughout the West, throughout the Islamic world, from Bukhara in the east to Muslim Spain in the west. Western European scholars, as well as followers from other regions and religions flocked to Islamic centers of learning. In fact, the intellectual influence of Islam was so great that in 936 AD, a council was held at Toledo in Spain to consider how to stop the impact of Islam on Christianity and the intercourse between the two communities. Because of historical prejudice, Western scientists and historians often ignore the tolerant nature of the past Muslim civilization and the contributions it made to European Renaissance, especially in science. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Professor Abdus Salam writes, "There is no question that the Western science is a Greco-Islamic legacy. However, it is commonly alleged that Islamic science was a derived science, that Muslim scientists followed the Greek theoretical tradition blindly and added nothing to the scientific method. This statement is false. Like all periods of intense scientific work, one first builds on what one has inherited. This is followed by an age of maturity, when doubts are raised on the teachings of the old masters, followed by a break. Such a break came with the rise of observation and experiment early in the sciences of Islam. Its clearest exponents were Ibn al-Haytham and al-Biruni." And again, you'll see some more great example of these great thinkers. Another great Western historian, Robert Briffault, in his monumental book, Making of Humanity, writes, the Greeks systematized, generalized, and theorized, but the patient ways of investigation, the accumulation of positive knowledge, the minute methods of science, detailed and prolonged observation and experiment, inquiry were altogether alien to the Greek temperament. What we call science arose in Europe as a result of a new spirit of inquiry, of new methods of investigation, of the method of experiment, and of the development of mathematics in a form unknown to the Greeks. That spirit and those methods were introduced into the European world by the Arabs. Modern science is the most momentous contribution of the Islamic civilization. Now, again, just to really add weight to this, George Sarton wrote one of the greatest books on history of science, his monumental work, really, and those who are interested in history and science should read this. And again, I'll quote from his book. He says, thus, from 500 to 450 BC is the age of Plato, followed by the ages of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, and so on. And then from 750 of the Christian era to 1100 CE Christian era, however, it is an unbroken succession of the ages of Jabir, Khwarizmi, Razi, Masudi, Abul Wafa, Al-Biruni, and Umar Khayyam. In those 350 years, Arabs, Turks, Afghans, and Persians, chemists, algebraists, clinicians, geographers, mathematicians, physicists, and astronomers of the Commonwealth of Islam held the world stage of sciences. Only after 1100 Christian era in Sarton's scheme did the first Western names begin to appear. However, for another 250 years, they share the honors with men of Islam like Ibn Rushd, Nasir al-Duntusi, and Ibn Nafis. So these were some of the great achievements of the Muslim world. And again, how am I doing for time? Let me see. So I want to finish by, about 10 minutes so that we've got some question time as well, 5 to 10 minutes. You need to read these on the Voice of Islam or listen to on the Voice of Islam and read them. So great figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as in the West as Jabir, lived around 776 AD in Kufa in Iraq, and is reputed as the father of modern chemistry. Again, lots of quotes of why he is regarded as the greatest chemist. Muhammad ibn Musa Khwarizmi, from 780 to 847, the father of algebra, the man who gave algorithm the name, the man who really used the zero, cipher. Again, as you know, that was brought from the Indian subcontinent, but it was the Muslims of Arabia. Even the Indians didn't know how to use it properly. And it was the Muslims that used the zero properly to give us the units that we have currently. The Christian and the Western world used to use Roman numerals with the, well, you've seen them, and it was impossible to do any mathematics with those. So that was one of the greatest contributions that Khwarizmi made, and his name lasted in Europe till only a few centuries ago. I must mention Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, one of the greatest scientists of all time, a great clinician whose books were used by clinicians in the West for centuries and centuries. But he was also a great chemist, a great mathematician, and again, you know, it's just amazing when you read about his achievements. I'm going to run through because I probably aren't going to have enough time to cover each one of these. And I think my friend Arshad is also giving a talk about seeking knowledge, and I'm certain he's going to pick on some of these. So if Arshad doesn't get it, then go to Voice of Islam Living History. As we're talking about history, I must mention Abul Hassan al-Masudi. He was known as the greatest geographer and encyclopedist of the Muslim world, and described by many Western historians as the Herodotus and Pliny of the Arab world. Al-Masudi revolutionized the writing of history by introducing the critical study of historical events. And instead of grouping his events around years, he grouped them around dynasties, a method later followed and elaborated by Ibn Khaldun. Again, we'll come to him later as well. Umar Khayyam, again, one of my favorites. Now, he's my favorite because of his poetry, but actually, he was a great scientist as well. So his Rubaiyat is worth reading, really. Khalifa Sirabi used to, again, mention Fitzgerald, his translation, and how good the poem was. But Umar Khayyam devised the Jalali solar calendar, and this was named after his patron, and he is even more accurate. It's written that it's even more accurate than the Gregorian calendar. The latter leads to an error of 1 day in 3,330 years, whereas Al-Khayyam's apparently leads to an error of 1 day in about 5,000 years. Again, this is covered by Professor Hitti in his books as well. So I come towards really concluding with some of the great figures, but the golden age of sciences in Islam was without a doubt the age around the year 1000 of the Christian era, with the legendary names such as Ibn Sina. Avicenna, he was known in the West, 980 to 1037. Ibn al-Haytham, known as Al-Hazan, 965 to 1039, and Al-Biruni from 973 to 1048. The best known of these three giants, of course, was Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who, contrary to the Greeks, regarded light as an emission by the luminous sources of particles traveling at finite speed. He understood the nature of heat and of force and motion. There were some great achievements, and there are books and books written on all these people, which you must read and find out what they achieved. I must make a mention of Al-Haytham. Again, those of you who watch Al Jazeera will have seen Jim Khalili's presentations on Islamic sciences, and again he goes on and on about Al-Haytham, one of the greatest physicists of all time. And besides making experimental contributions in optics, and I quote, enunciated that a ray of light in passing through a medium takes the path which is the easier and quicker, thereby anticipating Fermat's discovery of principle of least time by several hundred years. According to Professor Salam, who again loved this scientist because of his physicist background, he understood the law of inertia, later to become Newton's first law of motion. He described the process of refraction in a mechanical terms by considering the movement of particle of light as it passed through the surface of separation of two media in accordance with the rectangle of forces, a mode of approach rediscovered and elaborated by Newton. So, you know, these are, and then of course there's my all-time favorite Al-Biruni, who lived and worked in Afghanistan. Just imagine, these were some of the great figures. Al-Biruni was just one of them. You look at current Afghanistan and you look at that time, but he lived in Afghanistan and has been described by Professor Edward Sacho, who wrote a great book about him. Professor Sacho says he was the greatest authority in the works of, the greatest intellectual who ever lived on the face of the earth. Can you imagine that? And George Sarton also remarks he was one of the greatest scientists of Islam and all considered one of the greatest of all times. Again, Professor Salam says lots of things in his honor, and you know, when people talk about, oh, the Arabs did nothing else, Al-Biruni used to take Aristotle to task on virtually every single thing, and there are lots of quotes which show how he did that. And just in terms of mountains and rivers and formation of valleys and you know, a lot of the geological things that were discovered by later on Western people like Lyell and others who made a really revolution in understanding of earth and sciences. Al-Biruni was talking about how the rains basically, to wear away the mountains, then come through the rivers, and how the different valleys are formed, etc. So absolutely amazing. I am running short because you'll want to some questions, so I'm going to skip through some of the other things. So, and of course, it's not just the sciences, it was the classics, the writings, the architecture, and even in terms of warfare, etc. In how when you look at Raziallah who when he took Jerusalem, how peacefully a simple ruler who walked in and his servant was riding the camel. And then when you look at the first crusade and how the crusaders absolutely slaughtered the Muslims, and then you take the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin and how he let slaves go, and he really freed a lot of people, and there was not much bloodshed at all, etc. So all this thing about Muslims, they're doing things with the sword is absolute nonsense. Although the Muslim civilization continued to excel in many fields, I think I'm coming to the end now. Great empires such as the Mughal and Ottoman, an interest in science began to wane with time. With such illustrations, names, and such outstanding contributions to the world of science, one is bound to ask the question, why did creative science die out in Islam? I'm coming to the end, and this is an important question. Clearly, after the Abbasids, we had the Timur Empire, we had the Fatimid empires, we had the Ayyubids with Saladin and various other emirates, and we had the great Seljuks, and we had the Ottoman empires, and they kept things going. But it was not as great as during the Abbasid period. And so this is an important question. Why did that light die out? Starting from around 1100 CE, this decline was nearly complete. And by 1350 CE, what happened? What were the reasons? And one of the reasons given by one of the great historians and sociologists, really, of the Muslim world, Ibn Khaldun, sums it up. And that will hopefully leave me about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I'll probably finish with his quote. So Ibn Khaldun writes, and you know how great Spain was, apart from the scientific contributions with the great libraries and great thinkers as Ibn Arabi, great mystics and thinkers and sociologists like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, who I couldn't mention, and again, the whole dialogue between the rationalists, and Mu'tazilites and anti-Mu'tazilites and all that. It's a great reading for another time. So Ibn Khaldun writes, and he says, we have heard of late that in the land of the Franks and on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, there is a great cultivation of philosophical sciences. They are said to be studied again and to be taught in numerous classes, existing systematic expositions of them are said to be comprehensive, the people who know them numerous, and the students of them very many. Allah knows better what exists there, but it is clear that the problem of physics are of no importance for us in our religious affairs. And Waqar, you are covering the little bit in there, but I'm sure you can see. So we must leave them alone. And so the Muslim world did leave learning alone, and the light slowly faded out. And as my light is fading, I will, I think, probably finish there. And that leaves us about 10-15 minutes for some questions. I'm sorry if I've had to rush through, but history is just wonderful. I'm a scientist by background. My first love is science, and second is history. And I hope you found it useful, and I hope you will go to the Living History section in Voice of Islam and see a lot more, including origins of the universe, origins of language, you name it, we've done it, and we'll do a lot more, inshallah. Waqar, what do I do now?
You can rest for a moment. Thank you very much for, as expected, a very comprehensive lecture, Dr. Iqbal Sahib. We've had lots of questions coming through thick and fast, both on YouTube and here on Microsoft Teams.
Shall I escape my PowerPoint?
You can do. That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I will take it in turns with Shakil Rathor Sahib, who is monitoring the questions on YouTube. and I will share some questions coming through on Teams. You've obviously given a bit of a plug to the programs that you've been hosting on Voice of Islam, and I can vouch for the high quality of those podcasts, and they can be accessed on the Voice of Islam website. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Right, excellent. So if I can just start with the first question coming on Microsoft Teams. This is from Zubair. He asks, what factors made the Muslim wars against the Byzantines and Persians as defensive rather than as aggressive wars?
So what made the...
Yeah, so the question is, what made the Muslim wars against the Byzantines and Persians as defensive rather than as aggressive?
So basically, the Muslims were upstarts. They were new, as I mentioned to you earlier. And these were, two of the greatest empires. And clearly, they saw danger from a new faith and a new zeal in the Muslims. And the Muslims were clearly taught not to have aggressive wars, as only in defense could they fight. And even in Mecca early on, they weren't allowed to fight the Meccans until God Almighty had given that commandment. And clearly, as the message of Islam was spreading, these great empires wanted to crush, because obviously with the spread there was conversions, and there were obviously people wanting to come into the world of Islam, and the Romans wanted to crush that. At one stage, actually, both the Persians and the Romans made a treaty to say together we will crush them, but that failed. And so it is when the Persians were trying to crush the empires that the Muslims went, and people like Khalid bin the Walid and the greater other general went. From early Islamic history, the idea was to spread Islam, but when that was being crushed, then of course they had to defend the faith, and that's how the wars went on. Later on, of course, there were unjust Muslim rulers as well, no doubt, some of them, but these were the early great thoughtful Muslim conquerors and rulers.
Thank you, Jazakallah. Dr. Balsabi, you can stop sharing your screen now. That's great, thank you. Shakil Sahib, any questions from YouTube?
Yeah, there was.
Do I just press yes? That is it.
Yeah,
I press that. Okay, yeah, that's it.
Perfect, thank
you. There are lots of questions. To sum up with a very, very informative lecture, that's what the people saying. Really enjoying listening, enhancing my knowledge. So those are some comments. First question. I think you touched upon this just now, but the question comes from Rafiq Sab. Orientalists have alleged that Islam was spread at the point of sword. Could you throw some light on this accusation and refute these allegations? Jazakallah.
Well, I mean, especially the early Orientalists throughout, and even now, when you read, whether it's the Spectator or the Daily Telegraph or watch CNN, or it's a nonsensical view. The Quran makes it absolutely clear of how to spread the message of Islam, and when a just war is allowed, and only to respond to aggressors. And if somebody is being peaceful for you, you are not allowed to be an aggressor. That's clear cut. During the Khilafat al-Rashidun, that was followed very, very clearly. And even during the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, a lot of this was followed. I can't vouch for that for some of the other empires that came later on as well. But of course, the Crusades and the others were very, very aggressively undertaken against the Muslim world, and they had no choice. But they say, yes, Islam was spread by the sword. One of the interesting things is Michael Hart, apart from putting the Holy Prophet ﷺ as number one, he put Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu somewhere around the 30th out of 100 odd people. And one of the reasons he gave is that what Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu achieved was that it was a lasting empire that stayed till now around the area which he conquered. And this was well before Caesar, well before Charlemagne, and many other great conquerors and thinkers as well. And if the sword was used, people would have reconverted to whatever else they believed in. They never did. So this is totally unfair. And when you read some of these books that I mentioned to you, even the Western historians are saying that that's a nonsensical view. And Karen Armstrong, as one of the current newer writers, makes that an absolute nonsense. So I just think you have to be strong enough and brave enough to know your facts.
Jazakallah. Dr. Saab, the next question comes from Abdullah Malik and family. Firstly, they express Jazakallah for such a rich and informative lecture. The question is, can you please advise any good book of Islamic history which contains the comprehensive information to read for general knowledge?
The best book really, which covers the golden period up to the Abbasid Empire, called The History of the Arabs, is Professor Hitti's, which I mentioned, and you can Google and see it. It's a fantastic book. One of my favorites was during my student days was Professor Azati. He was an Iranian professor who wrote The Spread of Islam. And what he did was, in a wonderful intellectual way, of pulled together all the Western commentators and what they wrote about Islam in lots of different ways, about war, about peace, about science, about architecture, about all their contributions and different things. And that's a really good one. There are tons and tons of books, so you can, but maybe in the second lecture I'll compile a list of I love books, and I've got lots of so if people want to contact me, I can send some additional lists to them.
I think you've given a good incentive there for people to tune into your next lecture. Shakil Sahib, more questions from YouTube?
Yeah, there's a question from Sophie Ahmed. Do you not think that the golden age of Islam was during the life of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, ignoring the spread and demographics and spread later on?
Of course it was the golden age, the true golden age, because that's when the messenger of Allah comes and when the true light spreads. But remember, Hazrat Muhammad ﷺ was one person. If we only talk about just one person and his life and nothing else, it's a meaningless message. His message was for the community that he was going to develop, and that community, how it was going to flower and really guide mankind in a new direction. Many great, when you look from Mesopotamia to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians, to the Egyptians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, and whatever else, great empires have been. But the Muslim empires did have something special. And even the Ottoman, there's been a lot of, history is written by the victors, and the Europeans have been the victors over the last 300 years. And that's the people who have written everything. But we should be proud of course, the Holy Prophet's time was the golden period, but he wanted an ummah, he wanted a community that would spread his message and live up to his ideals. And some lived well up to his ideals and some not as well. But we should be proud of our civilization and our history.
Jazakallah, Dr. Saab. We have 5 minutes remaining, so we'll try and get through at least one more question, possibly a second. The next question comes from Naveed, and it's actually in relation to the golden age of Islam. His question is, do you believe that the golden age of Islam has gone, or do you believe that another golden age can be formed now?
Inshallah, another golden age will come, and this is why I said that initial light, that spark, is given by God's chosen prophets, and the Prophet Messiah Mahdi alayhi salam is the Imam of the time, our Prophet, the servant of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to revive Islam in its truest sense. And you can start seeing that by what Ahmadiyyat has achieved in just the first 100 years or so, with great figures like Chaudhry Zafarullah Khan Saab, Professor Abdul Salam, Imam Ahmed Saab, even currently in the world of economics, when you look at Atif Mia. Inshallah, let's hope we can produce many more Abdul Salams, and we can have a golden age of Islam again. It will happen, inshallah, and it may be an even greater age. Who knows? We might be going to the stars one day in our future generations. 300 years time, when the promised Messiah Mahdi alayhi salam's Ahmadiyyat will be spread all over the world and widely accepted, who knows what we will see. Those historians will write their own things.
Okay, we have 3 minutes remaining. Shakil Saib, I think maybe we can squeeze in one more question from YouTube.
Okay. So there's a question from Amir Sharif Saab. Also, so I was asking, what can we learn from the Muslim scientific approach from the antiquity to the present day? We are inspired, of course, but what few aspects can we learn and practice today?
That's a very good question, to be honest, because one of the things which I tried to point out, it was the Arabs who actually introduced the whole concept of observation, experimentation, trying out hypotheses and being able to prove them and reproduce them, etc. The Greeks were very good at conceptual sort of thinking and thinking outside the box and wide and all of that. That's fine. That's how human intellect develops as well. But God Almighty in the Holy Quran has told us that it is our duty to explore the universe He has created, everything between the heavens and the earth. And when we explore that, we'll have a wider understanding of everything, how the universe was created, how life has come to be, and how we can go to the other planets and whatever else that need to be. And I think, inshallah, Muslims need to follow that approach that the early Muslims did. And when you look at Professor Salam's discovery, for example, he when he got his Nobel Prize, part of it was his belief in the Holy Quran and Islam and the laws uniting the 4 fundamental laws. But there was a non-believer as well who also thought about it as well. So through faith, you can discover a lot of things as well, but science should be explored in its own way, and you should not use the Holy Quran as the book of science to do it, but you can use it to inspire you and to make sure that you can show things that practically work and that you can prove and that you can explain the world around us in every way and understand it in its every detail. And inshallah, we will do. And in sociology and other fields of history as well, we will be able to do well.
Dr. Balsaib, very enlightening lecture and responses as expected, and I think you've given a good flavour of what's to come in your next lecture on Friday of next week, which is looking at the Islamic Empire. But what you've also spoken about tonight, I think, leads very nicely into tomorrow's lecture, which is being delivered by Mohammed Ahmadi Sahib on the topic Islam in the West. So you can please make sure that you register and tune in for that same time tomorrow, 6:45 p.m. But just left for me to thank Dr. Balsaib again for a very comprehensive and illuminating lecture. And Allah bless you for your efforts and for sharing your observations, insights, and your great knowledge about the topic. Jazakumullah ahsanul jazaa. If I can now request everyone to please leave the session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.